Good morning. Today we talk wildfires and how to avoid them. And we hear more on the rising tide of illegal meat imports.
The scale we're talking about here is sort of going through the roof, and it's only building pace.
Let's start, though, with the UK's biggest food export, farmed salmon. Last year, we exported £844 million worth. The biggest overseas buyer for Scottish salmon was France, followed by the USA, which bought £225 million worth, nearly £250 million. So, when we kicked off a week looking at fish farming, on Monday's Farming Today, the impact of President Trump's trade tariffs was the obvious place to start. Tavish Scott is CEO of Salmon Scotland, the body which represents the industry.
I think at the moment it's too early to tell precisely what that impact will be. But what we are reassured by is the contacts we've had from importers of salmon from Scotland, very strongly supporting the continuation of that trade, looking forward to medium and longer term contracts. So that's encouraging.
Could there be an impact actually to the rural economy in Scotland? Because fish farming is quite an important part of that.
What we've done is to communicate and write to both governments, London and Edinburgh, asking for help with what I might loosely describe as the internal market of the UK, making sure that the parts that government are responsible for are made as effective and as efficient as they can be. So, for example, the regulation of aquaculture in Scotland is still carried out by 4 separate bodies. An independent report some years back said that should be one body. And similarly with the UK government, we need some help with European health certificates for exporting into the European Union. And we need the new Labour government in London to get rid of the paperwork and make that all electronic.
There are still critics of salmon farming, particularly on welfare and the environmental impact. Let's talk about the welfare first. There has been an improvement in mortality. So actually you were at 82.3% of survival. Is that an acceptable rate of loss in a farming system?
So we'd always want to be better. Survival, as you rightly say, is at a 4-year high, and that's a result of £1 billion of investment by our businesses. Do we want to be better? Absolutely. Every single day of the week, our people are working on improving those numbers.
What sort of things make a difference? What can you invest in that actually changes things?
Well, we've invested very heavily in ever greater understanding of what's happening in the marine environment. That means everything from practical kit to new monitoring equipment. That's where the introduction of AI technology in terms of how we feed our fish is helping our people become even better at what they do.
Some campaigners have called for a halt on new farms in Scotland. How much scope actually is there for expansion?
There is room for the right kind of expansion. Some of that would be the consolidation of farms into deeper water sites further away from some of the inland voes and sea lochs that we currently use. But for that to happen, we need to see changes to the consenting and regulatory process. And that's sadly been a bit slow to happen.
And for some, that will fill them with horror because they will think, hang on, we don't want to spread this out into deeper water, into other parts of the sea that we haven't used yet. That, they will say, is a very bad idea.
There are opponents to every kind of farming. Food security is ever more significant. So the kind of attitude which says you must stop seems to come from those who frankly just want to close us down. And I'm afraid that's frankly and thankfully not part of government thinking.
Tavish Scott, CEO of Salmon Scotland. As we discussed there, salmon farming has its critics, and we'll hear from them in a moment. First, Richard Baines took a boat trip up Scotland's west coast to a site owned by the Norwegian fish farmer Maui to find out about what some see as the future of the industry.
I'm on a fast launch in a heavy swell, heading to a fish farm near the island of Colonsay, west of Jura. It's very different out here to the calm loch waters of a traditional Scottish salmon farm.
Well, this is an open water site, a great environment.
This is one of a string of Maui offshore sites. Ali Geddes is the site manager.
It's a challenging place to work. You need the right equipment and you need the right crew. You're constantly looking at the weather forecast to see what's coming and then assessing what you can do in the day. Every morning we come out, we do the environmental checks. So we've got underwater cameras, surface cameras.
We're just looking initially for fish hunting the feed rather than just shoaling on the surface.
Liam McNeil monitors the cameras.
We're just sort of watching that, following it down to around about a depth of 10 metres. Anything below that, we will just stop the feeding for a minute, and then if they don't reappear, then that's that meal done. It's just getting your eye in, knowing and learning fish behaviour.
Maui's just bought the island of Sander near Campbelltown as a base for another offshore site, and their plans are part of a growing trend. The Norwegian firm Salmon is reported to be exploring salmon farm sites 3 miles off Shetland. Such sites with strong currents in deep water can avoid concentrations of waste on the seabed. Dougie Hunter is Maui's technical director in Scotland.
The fish are very robust in where they are. The currents and the wind action and wave action makes the fish very strong. The depths of the nets are about 20 metres, so they've got lots of space in that area to actually choose where they want to go in the water column. By nature of where we are, there's less sort of birds out there, there's less seals out there. We're about sort of 20 miles away from the mainland, so we don't tend to typically see many lice out in this location.
Despite the challenges, Ben Hadfield, the Maui Scotland Chief Operating Officer, says this is the future.
We see that our expansion is to be in open sea areas where the assimilative capacity is a lot higher. The wastes are taken care of by the environment within environmental limits, and we see that as the area for growth in our sector.
Ben Hadfield from Maui. Well, not everyone sees deeper waters as the answer for the industry. Andrew Graham-Stewart is interim director of the campaign group Wildfish.
Well, I'm very surprised that Maui has chosen to highlight its Colonsay farm. I've just dug out some of the officially published figures for the Maui farm on Colonsay. Back in January 2020, it had an escape of 73,600 fish. In the second half of 2024, the sea lice numbers on the fish were well over the Code of Good Practice level for the industry on 10 occasions. But perhaps the most shocking thing about the farm on Colonsay is how it has failed so dismally on the mortalities front. In October 2023, 202,000 fish died in just 1 week. That contributed to the most recent production cycle. This production cycle ended in 2024, September 2024, and the total losses amounted to 40% of the stock. So the Maui example really doesn't stand up as being anything akin to sort of environmental responsibility or even welfare responsibility.
Maui told us the figures are correct, but said that the fish deaths were down to Storm Babbitt, which prevented them treating the fish for gill damage caused by a naturally occurring amoeba. They say both overall fish escapes and sea lice numbers are at their lowest for decades, a point also made by the industry body Salmon Scotland. But Mr Graham-Stewart says that's nothing to be proud of.
Well, the 2024 figure of 18% mortality, according to Salmon Scotland, I find it rather odd for the industry to claim that as a success. This is only low relative to previously disastrous years. Any other livestock farming operation with 18%, let alone 25%, will be in serious trouble for allowing so many deaths. Then the industry's claim to have spent, I think it's £1 billion on fish health, is hardly a great boast when so many fish are still dying. That £1 billion must include the huge spending on all the pesticides and chemicals that end up being dumped in the sea, and all the physical and freshwater treatments for sea lice, which kill and maim so many salmon and cleaner fish.
Although the industry has, for instance, on sea lice, it has moved away from that use of pesticides, hasn't it, to use fish who eat the lice off the salmon?
Well, they use what's called cleaner fish, that's wrasse and lumpfish. Their use is surely unethical by any normal considerations. And at the end of the production cycle, they all die. I mean, I don't think the use of cleaner fish is anything to celebrate.
What could the industry do to make improvements that would satisfy wild fish?
In the short term, there needs to be a moratorium on any expansion of the industry until they've got all the problems that they're confronting under control. And in the medium to long term, we believe salmon farming in open cages is just not the way, it should not be permitted. They're likely to move production further and further north to the likes of Iceland or northern Norway. And as regards Scotland, whilst the industry is significant economically, particularly in terms of exports, we believe that economic contribution to Scotland PLC is overstated. All we ever hear about is the economic positives, none of the negatives, not least the negative impacts on other industries that depend on unpolluted coastal waters. Our conviction is that ceasing salmon farming would enable other more sustainable sectors to thrive.
Andrew Graham-Stewart from Wildfish. Firefighters across the UK have been tackling more wildfires this week, from the Mourne Mountains in Northern Ireland to the Scottish Highlands and the North Yorkshire Moors. In the Mournes, more than 140 fires have been reported in the past few days, and firefighters say most were started deliberately. David Doherty is Western Area Commander for the Northern Ireland Fire and Rescue Service. Speaking from Ballygawley in County Tyrone at the site of another wildfire, he said the damage has been considerable, and with some peatland alight, nesting birds and other wildlife have also been affected.
The conditions here are tender dry, so anywhere there is an ember is going to get an ignition source, it is going to burn. You're also dealing with peat bog here, so this can be burning below the surface, which again is quite complex for us to deal with. The issue here is that this is all rural, it's off-road, and it's very difficult for us to get water to it, so the crews have been working extremely hard with knapsack sprayers and beaters here in very arduous conditions to tackle this fire.
Commanded David Doherty in Northern Ireland earlier this week. The Ulster Farmers Union is calling for more grazing and controlled burning in some protected areas to reduce the risks. I spoke to John McClanahan, UFU Deputy President.
Yeah, well, I suppose we look at what we need for a fire, so there needs to be air, which is obviously there, and a lot of these are on mountains, so there's usually a bit more wind. There needs to be some sort of ignition, and that can be either deliberate or accidental, I suppose. But there also needs to be the material itself, and I suppose that was what we were noticing in a lot of these fires happening on designated sites, areas where the farmers are restricted in terms of how they can manage the land, where historically they would have grazed that land and used various other methods to control the shrub and the overgrowth on those sides of the hills. Those areas, due to designations, have those techniques have been restricted. And a consequence of that, and it is an unintended consequence of that, is that we just have more of this very combustible material on the hill. And if the conditions are right, we get the unfortunate circumstances that we're seeing at the minute.
So what aren't farmers then allowed to do, which you think would make a difference?
The biggest thing is grazing. I mean, in our designated sites, our farmers have to take their livestock off the hill at the start of November, and they can't put them back until the end of February. Lots of designated sites are slightly different, so they might not all be exactly the same, but generally speaking, livestock have to be removed from the 1st of November through to the 28th of February. And the consequence of that is we don't have that selective grazing that we get from sheep in particular and other cattle also on the hill during those winter months, which help to keep that scrub at a managed level, which means there's come the springtime and into the summertime, there's less about for it to combust.
The burning of heather actually is allowed in Northern Ireland between the 1st of September and the 14th of April. I suppose there are two sides to that. Firstly, that would reduce the fuel load, but it is possible that someone doing that may have inadvertently started fire.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, it is. I mean, that controlled burning, there's a number of benefits that we have from that. One of them is to control the fire load. It also has benefits for biodiversity and also for wildlife habitats, and that's been recognised for centuries. And when controlled burning is done properly in a mosaic pattern across a hill, that has many benefits. I mean, there's been no suggestion that any controlled burning has been responsible for any of the fires that we've seen breaking out in some of the areas that has happened over the last couple of weeks. But there is always a risk. We recognise that, and it's why the people who do this need to be properly trained, the farmers, and that training very often is passed on from generation to generation. It's a skill to know when to do it and to know how to do it and to wait for the right weather conditions. And when done properly, not only does it decrease the fire load on the hill, but also it can be is recognised as being beneficial, for both wildlife habitats and biodiversity. And of course for the shooting industry as well. Yeah, not so much an issue, I would suggest, on many of our hills, as perhaps it is in England, Charlotte. But, like I say, these hills have been managed for generations by farmers, and that, I suppose, is where it's difficult the reason why they've been designated sites is because of the way they've been so well managed, for generations of farmers. And then once that management is then interfered with, so they're told they can't graze or they can't do controlled burns as they may have done previously, then obviously the habitat changes, and undoubtedly an unintended consequence of that is we increase the fire loading, and that can lead to sort of the devastating consequences we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
And that balance is being talked about again because the UK government's looking to extend restrictions on burning on peatland, which makes sense to protect the peat, but will others worry again stop these controlled burns and so on? Do you have concerns about that?
Yeah, we certainly would have concerns. I mean, this is the reason why we do it in a particular time. Now, normally, you mentioned the period for controlled burns over here is from the 1st of September to the 14th of April. Now, the reason why it's that time of year is because, generally speaking, and this year has been a bit of an exception, there is still a high degree of moisture, both in the ground and in the plants themselves, so they're not as likely to cause wildfires. One of the good reasons for controlled burning is if it's done at the right time of year, we decrease the risk of having those wildfires, and in that usually during those summer months when everything is a lot drier, if those wildfires take hold, then the peat starts to burn, and that really can be devastating.
John McClanahan there, the Ulster Farmers Union Deputy President. Now, at the end of a long week in world trade, we thought we'd have a bit of a look at where we are now with food exports and farming. The USA has delayed most of the high tariffs it threatened, with most countries like the UK now facing a 10% charge. But the trade war with China continues, and some British farmers buying American feed may be affected by that. China faces 145% tariffs on some goods going into the US and extra costs on Chinese ships entering American ports. China has retaliated with 125% levies on some American goods. Ali Renison is director of SEC Newgate, a global research and advisory company, and a former trade advisor to the UK government. I asked if agri-food exporters are worse off today than they were last week.
Yes, I would say. It depends on, if you're a UK business that has been exporting agri-machinery, or if you're sort of exporting food and drink. There are some exceptions, but by and large, the US doesn't tend to have as high a sort of average sort of tariff barriers, let's say we do, or certainly the EU. So there are increase in costs of exporting that, certainly, with the 10% baseline going up.
Trade deal talks between the UK and the US continue. Now, within farming, there's some nervousness about what that might mean because of chicken and beef particularly. Are people right to be nervous?
I think there's always a nugget of truth in concerns. The question is how valid are they across the board? So if you look at something like chicken, and the big issue, at least with that kind of industry, the poultry industry, is that obviously this concept of what's called chlorinated chicken, which means that there's chlorine rinsing that goes on that's, forbidden in the EU and the UK, particularly around to try and get rid of various things like salmonella, and they use sort of chlorine to try and sort of rinse the carcass off. So the argument is less about whether it's an issue and more about how big of an issue it is, because if you listen at least to the National Chicken Council in the United States, they will say that only actually 10% of, let's say, chicken processing factories tend to use this kind of product. So I think it's an issue, but the extent of it and whether there's a way around it are up for debate.
We had a query from a farmer in Kent who is importing soya from the US. Now, he says it's being collected in May by a Chinese shipping company, and he's been told that he will be subject to a tariff.
Yeah, so this is one of the issues, and it remains to be seen exactly how the US is going to implement it. It depends on whether, let's say, if the ship is Chinese flagged, Chinese owned, that makes a difference. And keep in mind that when it comes to soya, this is a huge export for a lot of Republican states. There is just not enough demand domestically to actually sort of buy up all the soya. So I think that there is going to be some pressure put on, particularly in that industry. Out in the Midwest, they do a lot of sort of soya production. There's going to be a lot of pressure put on the president and the White House to try and kind of find a deal way around this, so that basically the restrictions that they're putting on vessels in particular does not actually have a knock-on effect on the ability to export. Having said that, there is a genuine concern, I would say, about what kind of shipping lines are you going to use. And, if I were a prudent farmer importing soya, I'd probably be looking to see what are some of the alternatives when it comes to looking local and also, speak to a freight forwarder to sort of see if there's any kind of ways around. But this is an evolving picture, and it may be that the way in which the United States actually implements some of these restrictions on Chinese sort of shipping vessels docking and putting huge fees on them to do so doesn't actually interrupt the agri-supply.
Ali Rennison. Farmers are calling on the government to look again at the amount of funding it provides to stop illegal meat imports coming into the country. The Dover Port Health Authority, which carries out the checks, has been offered £3.1 million by DEFRA for this financial year, the same amount as last year. But it says the funding is too low and will make delivering its remit immensely challenging and will leave the border largely open. Well, with cases of foot and mouth disease in Hungary and Slovakia and African swine fever on the European mainland, there are concerns that the UK isn't doing enough to prevent these serious contagious livestock diseases from entering the country. Kaz Graham spoke to Tom Haynes, Head of Policy for the National Pig Association, about the level of funding allocated to Dover Port Health Authority for checks over the next year.
We were very concerned that there would be a cliff edge and no funding. So the fact that there is a settlement is good news. But this funding is just a rollover of what was agreed last year. But even that funding alone only delivers a 20% operational coverage at the Port of Dover. There is therefore 80% of the time there is no checks going on whatsoever. And Dover Port Health Authority are also meant to be the Port Health Authority covering Coquelles, which is the Eurotunnel portal. And there, the funding doesn't stretch to do any checks there whatsoever. So there are still, even with this funding in place, there are still huge vulnerabilities and gaps in the system. There are big sort of concerns, one, around how far that funding will go, and two, the kind of stipulations that have been set out by DEFRA as to what they can use that for. The big kind of concern being the ongoing or lack thereof use of official vets at the border.
Why is that so important?
I mean, loads of these cases which the authorities on the border pick up are really, really complicated loads. You're opening the back of a lorry, a van, and it's got, to be quite frank, a whole mishmash of different carcasses in different states of decomposition. Those vets are really, really important part of identifying both the species and whether or not they've got disease and the kind of biosecurity risk that they present. Not having those vets basically takes what are already very complex cases and takes, in some cases, days to kind of unpick and just makes it much, much, much more complicated.
And what kind of risks do we face if illegally imported meat does get into the country?
So, from our point of view, obviously the big concern is pork products potentially infected with African swine fever, hence why we've been sort of talking about this for a number of years now. But, it could just as easily be an infection with foot and mouth.
And we heard on this programme just a few weeks back that illegal meat seizures at Dover have increased significantly since the new system for checking meat, the border target operating model, was introduced. Are border checks on meat at Dover, are they actually fit for purpose?
We've been, for a long time now, saying that we don't think the situation at Dover, and we talk about Dover because there is some money going in to do these checks, right? So, they're putting some money in, they're doing the checks and they're finding cases. Other ports are not getting any funding whatsoever, and it's kind of a bit of a blind eye as to what's going on through that backdoor route. But just looking at Dover alone, I think we've now gone over the 220-tonne mark since work started there in October 2022. And I think since the start of this year alone, they've seized over 60 tonnes. The scale we're talking about here is sort of going through the roof, and it's only building pace.
And the Dover Port Health Authority has asked DEFRA now to urgently review the funding offer. What do you think needs to happen?
On the specific point around Dover funding, we're all aware there are difficult funding constraints across government, but that this work is relatively small amount of money to stop what would be a humongous, both economic but also sort of social and long-term impact on the agricultural sector. That's the first bit regarding funding, but there is a bigger piece here regarding the sort of commercial imports channel, the border target operating model, BTOM. That doesn't look to be working either. We're seeing what looks to be a shift kind of away from the personal import route and towards that commercial route because the scales are so much bigger, and these kind of organised crime networks know that they can get this product in through those commercial routes due to sort of inbuilt vulnerabilities in the system.
Tom Haynes from the National Pig Association. We asked the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs about the level of funding it's offered, and in a statement it told us, we remain committed to agreeing an appropriate funding model for 2025-26 with Dover Port Health Authority to help tackle illegal imports, with a sharp focus on exotic disease safeguard measures. It also said, we will do whatever it takes to protect our nation's farmers from the risk posed by animal disease. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.